The leaders of the country were heavily influenced by the British welfare state and its ability to clear slums and provide modern, affordable homes. They wanted the same for Singapore.
The families, which had once lived in slums, now had private entrances, glass windows, piped water, gas, and electricity.
The government embarked on a massive public building program, creating huge estates across the island, rehousing the vast majority of the population. But there was always a fundamental difference between the Singaporean and British approach. Instead of renting out apartments, people were encouraged to buy them. Lee Kuan Yew wanted to avoid the sort of dependency culture he had seen emerging in Britain.
We started selling a few blocks. He said, this is yours. You pay it by installment over 20 years. And we could see the stark difference between a owner-occupied high-rise and a rented high-rise. One was cared after, looked after, precious because it's theirs. The other just declines. So we decided that we'll give everybody a chance to own their own home.
Ironically, this approach to social housing would eventually find its way back to Britain when Margaret Thatcher came to power. She'd been a long-time admirer of Lee Kuan Yew and, inspired by the Singaporean model, encouraged tenants to buy their own homes. Few people in Britain realized the policy had been copied from Singapore. Today, 80% of Singapore's population live in apartments built by the state but owned privately. New satellite towns have been created. The landscape of the island has been transformed. Cherian George is a writer who has chronicled the changes in Singapore. The road where he used to live no longer exists. It's been bulldozed to make way for a new overpass.
So I'm guessing that our front door would have been around here. My living room. Welcome. It's the first time I've been back since 20 years, I guess, yeah. I mean, it's sad that, you know, I can't point to a place and say that, well, yes, this is where I grew up, because it's gone. But, you know, it's nothing different from what most Singaporeans go through. The memory of Singaporeans' childhoods is something that tends to be sacrificed in this, you know, in the name of progress. It's hard to feel settled when things are moving so fast.
For decades, Singaporeans have enjoyed almost unbroken economic success. But the price of that success has been their compliance. They've had to accept whatever changes the government has deemed necessary. But at some point, the first notes of dissent would be heard. On the 31st of October 1981, something extraordinary happened in the Anson district of Singapore. The People's Action Party that had governed the country since independence lost a by-election.
I was the organizing secretary, and I did tell Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew that we will lose many votes. So he asked me, would we lose? I said no, but we lost.
The winner of the election was J.B. Jeyaretnam, a lawyer turned politician and leader of the Workers' Party.
It was a night that, has to be lived to remember. And I lived that night. It was wonderful. The crowd just went wild. There was a great feeling of, well, perhaps things are going to change.
Jeyaratnam was seen as a champion by the poorest in Singapore, those who had benefited least from the economic miracle. And now, he was the first ever opposition member of parliament. For 16 years, every seat had been held by the PAP.
I was a bit intimidated. But one gets used to it, one gets into the fight. And I'd chosen to go into the fight. So you get braver. I was referred no less than 6 times for unprofessional conduct. And they said that was a record.
We regarded him as rather destructive. Destructive in the sense that his views, were there to catch hold, would have destroyed Singapore. He was actually more for welfare, which you were dead against. You offer welfare to the people, we think over 2 elections, the place will be destroyed.
In 1984, general elections were held across the island. Jeyaratnam stood again in Anson, and again he won a spectacular victory.
The PAP were confident that they would recapture Anson, and I was returned from that constituency with an increased majority.
Well, I'd like to speak to the voters of Anson. My dear, dear voters of Anson, you've made it again. You have withstood the onslaught of the mighty PAP.
We're not going to give up that easily to anybody who challenge our rule. So we therefore take opposition very seriously. So when you lose one seat, there's great consternation.
Jeyaratnam would not remain in Parliament for long. In 1986, he was prosecuted over a false declaration of accounts by his Workers' Party. He was fined and sentenced to a month in Queenstown prison.
The prison officers were embarrassed. They knew about me, but I didn't get any preferential treatment. It was grim.
As a convicted criminal, Jeyaratnam had to give up his seat in Parliament. But Singapore was a Commonwealth country, and the last court of appeal was still in London. With the law lords of the Privy Council. In 1988, they heard Jeyaratnam's case and overturned the conviction, describing it as a grievous injustice.
I came back and asked the president to remove my convictions. And what was his reply? You have shown no remorse, no penitence. I hadn't admitted that I had committed offenses, and though I can't be pardoned. Privy Council said I had not done anything wrong.
Eventually, Jeyaratnam did return briefly to Parliament, but his career was dogged by a series of complex lawsuits brought against him by the leaders of the PAP.
The hatchet man of Singapore.
These days, he fights not from parliamentary benches, but from shopping centres, selling books that chastise the government,
The hatchet man of Singapore.
and in particular, the man who has twice successfully sued him for libel, Lee Kuan Yew.
I have told him that unlike other leaders, I carry my own hatchet.